Welcome everyone to the Thoughtworks Technology Radar Volume 27. The latest version of our radar is coming out really soon. So what we like to do each time is share a bit of a sneak peek with you all by sharing some blips and also some themes from the upcoming radar. So let's go ahead and get started. Great. So to introduce myself, my name is Vanessa Towers. I'm a principal technologist at Thoughtworks based out of North America. And today I'll be acting as your moderator. I'm joined by two of my colleagues who will be today's speakers. Brandon Byars, if you can jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa, and thanks everybody for showing up. Brandon Byars, I'm head of technology for Thoughtworks North America. I am part of the team that puts together the radar, which we cleverly call Doppler. So I was in the room when these votes and decisions happen. So certainly, if you disagree with any of the decisions, you can cast that disagreement my way. Thanks you all for showing up.
Please jump in, introduce yourself.
Yes, I wanted to spare you from having to say my surname. I'm Georgina. Yes, Giannoukou. I'm from the Thoughtworks Madrid office, and I'm not part of the Doppler group that creates the tech radar, but I had the luck of being a visitor in this year's edition, and I saw a bit of the process. So yeah, thank you folks for coming in.
Awesome. We have a really great team today. Moving on to the next slide, we can introduce the tech radar. So before we jump straight into sharing today's blips, I'd like to just really quickly go over what the tech radar is, just in case we have anyone on the call that might be joining us for the first time. Even though this is our 27th volume, we've been doing it for quite a while. So what it is, it's a publication that we produce at Thoughtworks twice a year. The way it's put together is it's actually crowdsourced by our Thoughtworkers who are working globally. There's more than 12,000 of us now. Out there working with our clients each day on projects all around the world. And what we like to do as thought workers is we like to share our opinions on the technology landscape a lot that we're working in. And we share those opinions in terms of what's working well, but also perhaps not so well on our projects. So that's what we want to share with you today. And I think something that's really special about the tech radar that we produce is the fact that at Thoughtworks, we're actually a technology agnostic consulting company. And so, you know, you can't pay us to get something on the radar. In fact, you might notice that there's a lot of open source software on it. And that's because we use a lot of open source software, you know, at our clients. So what shows up on the radar truly is reflective of our collective, you know, real world experience in the industry, building software for our clients. So we think that's quite special and quite valuable, and we're excited to share that with you. So what you can see on this slide, a little bit about the radar model that we use. Basically, when something lands on the radar, we call that a blip. So you're going to hear that word a lot today. And if you look at that radar model with that quadrant on the right-hand side, if we start at the center and we move outwards, there are actually 4 rings. And so the first ring on the radar is the adopt ring. And if a blip falls into adopt, what that really means is we consider it quite a proven technology. And most likely it's in fairly wide use across our client engagements. And then moving outwards into trial. For a blip to be in trial, it's likely to be a little less mature than those in adopt. However, we still consider it ready for use or perhaps ready for trial. If it meets your use case and your environment. And then moving out again into the assess ring. Assess is really, you know, you can think of the blips here as items that are sort of new and promising or interesting. It might be a little bit too early for Thoughtworks to have a definitive judgment on what's in the assess ring, but we think it's worth keeping your eye on what's going on here. And then in that final ring, hold, that's the only sort of negative ring that we have on our radar model. And what it really means, if a blip is in that hold ring, we're sort of saying we've seen it being used problematically at our clients. And so it's not to say, you know, drop everything and stop using it, but rather, you know, maybe it's time to review usage. It might be that the industry is actually moving away from it, or there's a lot of misuse. Or perhaps it's something that's just not quite ready for prime time. But in any case, if something's on hold, our general advice is to proceed with caution. And then in terms of what can go on the technology radar, we call each instance a blip, as I mentioned. And a blip that we're going to share with you today, it's either going to be a technique that we use, and we'll be sharing a lot of techniques today. It could be a language or a framework. a tool, or a platform. And so they're our general categories for our blips. So what you can expect in today's webinar, if you've just joined us, is a little bit of a reveal of some of the blips that made it onto the latest radar. And we'll also present a couple of emerging themes. And the themes that we have to share with you today are things that bubbled up from the many conversations that happened in the room during our internal radar collection process, which, as Brandon mentioned, Brandon was fortunate to be involved in that process this year. So throughout today's webinar, we do have a Q&A. We invite you to ask questions. Please go ahead and invite you to use that Zoom Q&A function, and we'll do our very best to monitor that and answer your questions throughout. So let's all get started with some of the content for volume 27. I would like to hand over to Brandon to share our first blip for today.
Yeah, thank you. If we can end the slide share, we are doing a bit of a Zoom experiment here where I'm just going to use my virtual background as the slide. And this is kind of indicative of, it gives you a taste of what Vanessa was talking about. So we have a quadrant devoted to techniques. And one of the techniques that we think is very interesting to talk about this time around, we've had some experience around it, is this idea of taking observability practices that were really developed to help bring telemetry and debuggability of unknown unknowns in a production distributed environment, and take those same techniques and bring them into your build environment, into your CI/CD platform. And there's a couple of different techniques that we've seen that we think contribute to calling this as a generalized technique. One of which we've had experience using tracing technology. So in this case, we used Honeycomb, which has a lot of observability built around wide events and tracing. And what tracing is you take a call graph and maybe a microservices environment, and you have microservice A calls service B and C, and there's a call chain, and you can get some information, some timing information, some debugging information around each of those steps in the call chain. That same approach ports pretty well to a complex CD environment where you have multiple stages, and you might have fan in and fan out. And so each stage, for example, or subset of a stage, you can capture as a trace. And while we've had experience doing this with an insurance company, and there's a book that Charity Majors and some of her colleagues at Honeycomb published recently, there was a guest chapter published from an engineer at Slack, where Slack talked about taking the same approach for their CD infrastructure in the early days of the pandemic. That approach does require some changing of each of the stages of the jobs that run in CI/CD. An alternative approach, and Vanessa mentioned open source. So Thoughtworks has, one of the Thoughtworkers, one of our colleagues has produced a tool called BuildViz, Build VIZ, that takes an alternative approach. A lot of these SaaS CI/CD platforms, Circle CI, Azure DevOps, et cetera, GitHub Actions, they have APIs that expose information, and BuildViz will query that information after a build to give you the same type of diagnostic information that you might get through tracing. So there are a couple of different ways of implementing it, but we've found as CI/CD platforms and pipelines themselves become more complex, that taking the lessons that we've learned around observability in a production environment, applying them to the build environment can provide a lot of lift. So we encourage, if you have a complex pipeline yourself, if you're struggling with non-determinism, duration, this is a powerful technique that can bring a lot of insights into your infrastructure.
Thank you, Brandon. And this is a new technique in the trial ring. And it was great to hear you mention some tools there, because I remember our Thoughtworks teams having to sort of hand roll solutions in this space a few years back. So anything that makes that easier for everyone is very welcome. Again, just a reminder to everyone, we would love to take your questions today. Encourage you to share your questions with us in the Zoom Q&A feature. Otherwise, we're ready to move on to the next blip. Thank you, Georgina.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk one more time about taking cognitive loads. And I say one more time because I think this is the second time this is mentioned in the Tech Radar, but this time in the Adopt ring. We believe that theme topologies, which the theme topology load term comes from and is used for, is a good way of organizing tech businesses. They propose 4 types of themes and 3 types of interactions, and they consider Conway's law and cognitive loads in order to maximize efficiency and product delivery. And why taking the cognitive load matters, and we should be taking into account regardless if we're implementing theme topologies or not. We know that every individual, for example, has a certain capacity of holding knowledge and changing context in a certain amount of time. The same holds true for teams. Let's say, for example, you're an enabling team in your organization and you help the organization with their CI/CD pipelines, for example, and suddenly it goes very well and you're being asked to build more and more features and accommodate more and more teams. It's very easy to just take on more things and take on more products for your team. But this will have a direct impact on how much the team can produce and how efficient they can be. So on one hand, it measures this type of number of product features a team can have, but also how they build, test, and deliver software. If your day-to-day ways of producing software are a bunch of manual tasks, probably it's going to add up a lot to, in general, the cognitive load. So there are ways to measure it. There's a template from theme topologies that kind of measures these cognitive loads, but you need to kind of configure it for your team, depending on the certain things specifically you have for your team. In general, it's a good measure for understanding how much more your team can handle and whether they're handling already too much.
Thank you, Georgina. Yeah, I really love the people first approach that you're talking through there. And it's great to see this blip move into the adopt category, so we can start to think about it as perhaps a organizational, sensible default. Okay, let's move on to the next blip. Brandon.
Yeah, so Svelte, which I like to joke a lot of people would use to describe me, not quite true. I'm a tall guy, relatively big, but it's a JavaScript component framework. The sort of 800-pound gorilla in the room, for those of you who've been paying attention to the single-page application world, is React and its cousins. And what the innovation that React brought to the industry was this idea of a virtual DOM. So DOM updates can be expensive in the browser. React will capture the intended changes in the virtual DOM. It'll compare it to the real DOM, and then it'll make the changes necessary. And that all happens in the browser's runtime context. So the downsides of that approach are you have a fairly heavy footprint of JavaScript you have to download. You have the runtime performance characteristics of the virtual DOM comparison, and then state management itself is a real hard problem to solve in the React ecosystem. And every time that we've had a radar, in fact, one of our themes last time was that this recognition that there doesn't seem to be kind of a standard default in state management, at least in our experience in the React world. There's always some new attempts at trying to solve that problem more cleanly. Svelte takes a very different approach to solving the same state management problem. It takes the idea of the DOM manipulation out of the browser's context with the virtual DOM and shifts it into a compiler. So Svelte is basically a JavaScript compiler that will take the intended state changes that you as a developer make, and it will add a little bit of code to surgically update the DOM in the browser itself. So it's frameworkless by the time it gets to the browser. It's just JavaScript. And that has a number of benefits. Certainly, the runtime performance has a lot of benefit from not having to manage some of the DOM comparisons in the browser itself, because the compiler has done that up front. That has knock-on effects in terms of battery usage if you're providing a website for a mobile experience, for example. But it also means that there's just less code to write. And I think that is a pretty powerful add-on for the developer experience. A lot of the developers that we spoke to who recommended this blip talked about how pleasant a learning curve Svelte was for the team that they were working on, because while there is some magic that happens in the compile step that is unusual, the actual amount of code that you write is much more focused, because you can rely on that compile step to solve a lot of problems for you. So while it doesn't have the same talent base in the industry, it doesn't have the same adoption in the industry as some of the other single page application frameworks, we think the just interesting paradigm shift that is taken from some of the other ones is worth paying attention to. And we put it in trial, as you see here. I answered one of the questions in Q&A, but I know it's hard to keep up with everything that's happening in Q&A. So one of the questions was, hey, what's our criteria? Do we have to have real world experience for using these tools? Trial, for anything that we put in trial, the answer is yes. One of the questions that we ask our teams is, have you used this in anger in production? And the answer has to be yes for us to put it into trial or adopt. So we've had several teams across the globe who have used this, certainly not as much as React, but the teams that have used it have had some really good experiences with it. So we certainly recommend this being on your radar as well.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions that came in actually relating to Georgina's earlier blip on team cognitive load. And the questions are asking around any ideas or suggestions on how to measure. I'll just put that out there to the group before we move on.
Should I go for it now, or maybe for later? Brandon, you want to go for it?
Well, I'm happy to share what I'm familiar with, which is a lot of teams have used survey-based approaches to measure cognitive load. In fact, if you search, you will find GitHub surveys that other folks, including inside and outside Thoughtworks, have used. And it's qualitative data, but you can track qualitative data over time, so you get some trend lines. And that's a pretty powerful approach, because what some teams have done is correlate that qualitative data to more quantitative data around velocity or tech debt metrics, or things that maybe the product manager might care about. And you start to, what we've seen in certain clients, including one in Spain, is there are some interesting correlations around the reduction in cognitive load and an increase in velocity in the context that we've done that.
Awesome. Thank you, Brandon. Okay, what blip do we have coming up next, Georgina?
We're going to talk about carbon efficiency as an architectural characteristic, and I'm going to now change my background to reflect the slide. That's a big one. I hope I'm standing in the right place. Cool. So carbon efficiency as an architectural characteristic. We know green tech, sustainable tech, carbon awareness have taken the center stage the last couple of years. That's reflected on, for example, Azure, AWS, GCP, introducing tools to measure energy consumption and carbon impact of the software we're running, especially tech organizations. And we also have the carbon cloud carbon footprint, I think, an open source tool that measures analytics around carbon impact. And we say, okay, now we know, we're aware of what's our carbon impact, let's say. We've introduced tools to optimize it on the infrastructure. What if we introduce it as a characteristic when we are designing the architecture of a software? The same way we're considering software, again, scalability, availability, efficiency, building the right thing, all taking account on trade-offs. The same way we can introduce in the design carbon efficiency. We said that this is an assessed blip. Why? Because we know it's important. We know it's going to be very relevant. We don't know yet how it's going to look like. And we urge teams to try out ways and figure out ways, besides putting the responsibility on one small team or one small person in the team, and especially in the platform infrastructure, specifically using cloud, for example, but rather to the enabling and cross-aligned teams understanding the trade-offs. And there's a great article from two Thoughtworkers, Chris Ford and Daniel Frappe, called Green Team Topologies. It's a way to introduce the green tech mindset in all levels of the organization. So your organizational structure, having green tech in mind, will reflect the software you produce. We're really looking forward to see what's next in carbon efficiency when it comes to software.
Thank you, Georgina. I love this one. And I love that you're kind of sharing that this is a great call out, this technique for folks out there that are driving evolutionary architectures, on the ground and want to start experimenting within their organization in regards to how to start introducing these green tech practices. This is a great place to start. Thank you. Okay, let's keep going. Over to you, Brandon, if you're ready.
Well, yeah, before we transition to the next blip, I might just take a stab. I saw one of the questions from Michael Perry in the Q&A around comparing carbon efficiency of various tools. And the specific mention was serverless versus Kubernetes, and I'm not sure in that specific example if there's some comparisons. But Thoughtworks is a member, a founding member of something called the Green Software Foundation, and they've published some research around carbon efficiency of things like programming languages, I think even various design patterns and programming languages. So there is some research that is starting to emerge in that space. It's not as mature, I think it's not mature enough to answer the specific question that Michael answered, at least not to my awareness. But it is an interesting space to keep your ear to the ground. And I saw somebody put this in the chat, but just to host some panels so not everybody saw it. But Thoughtworks also has led and contributed to a tool called the Carbon Cloud Footprint, which works across the 3 major cloud providers and does give you a view of, basically takes memory, CPU, and storage data. There's some algorithms that translate that into something called power use efficiency. And then there's some external information that sources the type of energy for the grid for that region of AWS, GCP, Azure, whether it's coal or green, and gives you some estimate of carbon usage in the cloud based on the services that you're using. All right, so Georgina, I don't know if you had anything to add to that. Michael, hopefully that gives some answer.
That was perfect, thank you.
Yeah. All right, so K6 is my next one here. So K6 is, I think, a really interesting example of how the radar really benefits Thoughtworks internally. We recommended, the Thoughtworker recommended K6 as a performance tool a couple of years back, and they were exploring it in the context of the client engagement they were in. So we put it in the assess ring. Assess is sort of our ring to put interesting technology that excites thought workers on the ground, but that we can't claim to have production usage of it. And so we put out there as something that is of interest, and that is a way not just of announcing that we have thought workers interested in it to the market when we publish the external radar. It's also a good knowledge management tool for us internally, because a lot of thought workers also read the radar, and that's one of the ways that we pass information across those 12,000 colleagues of ours that Vanessa was mentioning all across the globe, all working in different technologies, all working in different industries. And since that time, we've had a pretty steady progression of usage around K6 and validated that the interest was warranted. K6 is, you write the performance test in JavaScript. There's a low-code test builder if you want to use that approach, although we find a lot of value in versioning the code. The API is pretty simple to use, and the ecosystem around K6, I think, is quite impressive. It plugs into a number of observability tools, so you can get Grafana, a New Relic instrumentation that provides a lot of insights in terms of what your performance tests unearthed. It has a lot of capability in terms of wiring into your CI/CD pipeline and providing certain test assertions in a fairly easy way, thresholds that you have to meet. We think the tool itself has really done an amazing job of balancing developer experience, including things like the ability to version control it as code to put wired into your pipeline, the sort of ecosystem of plugins that it supports to make things like CI/CD and observability much easier, and just the power of the tool, the command line interface, the ability to stop and start it and capture a lot of information. It's quickly become one of our go-to performance testing tools. And so we think if you haven't come across it, it's a really interesting one to explore in your context as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brandon, for that readout on K6.
Yeah, you bet.
Sounds like a very cool tool that's much needed in the performance testing space. Always by nature. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Oh, and I see a question in the Q&A from Lena, whether it can be used for iOS and Android mobile app performance. And the short answer is I don't think so. I think it would hit the website, so you may be mobile web, but I don't think we'll have the full emulation around it.
Awesome, thank you. And please keep those questions coming. Thank you for those that have asked questions so far. We're doing our best to run through those. Appreciate that. Okay, let's move on to the next one, Georgina.
Yeah, so the next one is SPA by default, meaning single page applications. It's not going to be a new term for especially front-end developers. This is the second time we put this one as well on hold. And Vanessa, as you explained, on hold is a practice we see that maybe it's used in a negative way or it's not so beneficial in the end of the day, even though it's still good for certain uses. So what we say is not a stop or a hold to SPA, but more of like an SPA by default as an architecture. We see this because especially the new generation of software developers learn from the development using React and Vue, and it went really well with your Svelte speech before, Brandon, where SPA is the way to go, and server-side rendering is something belongs to the past, or not even learned by newer generations. And we see that this is neglecting the fact that CEO might perform poorly using SPA. We neglect maybe the initial load of a certain page, and there's still ways to enhance user experience, like using techniques like Hotwire with a server-side rendering. So we say, again, study the trade-off, understand that using an SPA way is an architectural decision. You don't necessarily have to do it because the framework pushes you to do it, only when necessary. And yes, let's see, this world is continuing to evolve. Let's see if we can even find hybrid ways, not necessarily using only SPA or only server-side rendering, and see how we can kind of merge those two worlds.
Yeah, and this might be a good opportunity to circle back to a couple of the questions we have, because we did have some questions around Svelte that obviously intersect with SPA by default. And just, you know, to provide lip service, because I'm afraid I can't provide a really in-depth answer, and Georgina, unless you can. But we had one from Irvin around static site generation versus Next versus Astro, and then one from an old colleague and friend, Salim Siddiqui, and a published author as well on test-driven development, talking about Electron app Svelte and the sort of build and packaging deployment options there versus Svelte. And I admit I'm not deep in front-end engineering. This is why we crowdsource a lot of these blips. But I think just to sort of provide a philosophy that can inform the answer, and I think Georgina did a good job of talking about this in terms of even questioning the idea of single page applications by default, is we obviously run into a lot of different technology across our client base across the globe. And so we do use a lot of these technologies, and the reason we put certain things in various rings of the radars to say, this is a good idea in the right context. That may not match your context. And there's certainly other options, single page application versus multi-page application. If you're in the single page application, you know, can you look at, virtual DOM tools versus Svelte versus, the Electron model. And some of those have made it to the radar, and you'll see some perspective published in Thoughtworks, some haven't. But we aren't saying that there's one true way to do anything. And I realize that may be a little bit of a dissatisfying answer, but that's certainly the most depth I can provide on some of the front-end tooling. Okay, so the next blip I think is a really interesting one. So for those of you who read the original Google SRE book, Site Reliability Engineering, there were a number of really interesting innovations that I think came out of Google in that space. One was a more thorough breakdown of what a lot of times we sort of naively just called SLAs, and they said, no, SLAs have generally a financial penalty to them. There's some money or some incentive to keep an SLA. And so to really inform a healthy SLA, if you get to that point, you need a clear understanding of the measurement and the sort of threshold of that measurement. So they call those SLI, service level indicators, and SLOs, service level objectives. And that might be around 99% of calls responding under a certain threshold for response time. So the response time itself would be the SLI, and the threshold would be the SLO. And a number of observability tools started to bake in dashboards around SLOs. So you can go to Datadog and Honeycomb, Dynatrace. All of them will have SLO dashboards these days baked in. And a proprietary mechanism of configuring the threshold for the measurement, the threshold for the SLO. And there's some momentum now around a sort of vendor neutral specification language around SLIs and SLOs. And the one I'm familiar with is called OpenSLO. And it has to solve that standard kind of chicken or egg problem of any sort of vendor neutral specification to get enough players in the ecosystem bought in, enough consumers who are interested in this to use it, just like any sort of platform business model. The good news is that OpenSLO does seem to have some early momentum. I saw that Sumo Logic put together a tool called SLOgen, SLOGEN, like generate, to contribute, and to provide some monitoring dashboards on top of an OpenSLO specification. And I think it's really neat because if it gets enough ecosystem adoption, and we put it in assess to recommend we're interested, but we don't think this has the maturity yet to sort of rely on this and as the core of your production infrastructure. But if it does get enough ecosystem adoption, what that means is you can version your SLOs and SLIs as code in a vendor neutral way. You can start to test for SLOs. There's some other interesting tools that provide you the ability to start capturing just some tests of SLOs as part of your pipeline, which I think is kind of interesting. And then ideally, you can have a lot more standardization and pluggability of monitoring of those across the observability ecosystem. So if you have a couple of different tools or you're looking to change tools, this provides you the ability to do that in a very clean way. But I think having just the simple ability to version it instead of sort of hand configure this in your monitoring tool already provides a much better developer experience. And you can start to imagine the possibilities that you can piggyback on that in terms of testing, in terms of certain verifications that you might make on the way to production. And then obviously the tool set that supports that in production itself. So we're really interested to follow the evolution of this pattern. We think it's an interesting one. And we look forward to sort of encouraging ecosystem adoption because in general, we think it's a good idea.
Thank you, Brandon. I'm just having a quick look at some of our questions. We did get a question that just came in around, do you assess blips based only on your client base or more globally? I think we sort of touched on this before. All the blips that we're sharing with you today and in the radar are crowdsourced by our thought workers that are working on client projects. And our thought workers are working globally. And so not just in North America, we have offices all around the world, some 12,000 thought workers who are, working for our clients globally. So I hope that helps to answer that question. And then, are there any other questions? I'm just seeing, and I encourage folks to continue asking questions. We've got one more blip to present and then a couple more themes to jump into today.
Well, then I'll jump to the last one, if that's okay. Perfect.
Please.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you, Georgina.
So I hope I'm sitting on the right side again, because someone mentioned that we're kind of hiding the rings. I hope folks can see it. This is a favorite for the data community. Great Expectations. I'm not talking about the book nor the movie. It's an open source tool that helps you set expectations for literally for your data pipelines within your data pipelines. So expectations for what? Checking anomalies in your data after certain data processing activity, validating whether your data is the one expected, is what you're expecting after, again, certain migration, ingestion, or any kind of activity. And why do the data community, at least at Thoughtworks, is considering now a sensible default to use great expectations? First, because it's very easy to use. You don't necessarily need data engineering skills to use it and enhance it. It's literally a JSON file with plain language of expectations, let's say, from this table, getting this attributes and tell me if it's equal to the number of things, like very plainly. It can be changed just by being aware of the domain of your data. The documentation is really rich. The community is really welcoming, very open. User experience is also great if you want to visualize your expectations or results. It doesn't store data, it doesn't execute pipelines. It's literally a built-in tool. That's the way we're doing unit tests for non-data related software development. And one thing that we need to be aware, folks that use it know already, it's mostly built for a Python environment. It's also written in Python, if I'm not mistaken. But that shouldn't be a stopper for most data folks. And we'll see in the future whether that will change and whether more different kind of non-Python environments can also utilize these. There are equivalent tools for using TensorFlow, and I think they're mentioning this in the documentation. But for now, if your mostly go-to language is Python and you using any type of data transformations, please try Great Expectations and incorporate it.
Thank you, Georgina. That was our last blip that we had to share with everyone today. If there aren't any more questions, what we would do next is actually turn it over to Brandon and Georgina to share a couple of emerging themes that came out of the upcoming radar. And as I mentioned before, themes are not drawn from specific blips, but they're rather sort of representative of ideas that bubbled up from the many conversations that happened in the room during our internal radar collection process with our Thoughtworks Doppler group. So let's jump into those. I think we're going to start with Brandon and the first theme.
Yeah, that's a really great description, Vanessa. Thank you for that. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of the process, as we query all of our account teams globally, we get a lot of several hundred recommendations for blips, probably in the thousands, but there's some filtering that happens before it gets to us in the Doppler room. And we try to distill it down to roughly 100 blips for every radar, and that includes carrying some forward from the previous radar. So there's a pretty healthy set of conversations that have to happen to synthesize the information that we're getting. And even the blips that didn't make it still contribute to the themes. One theme that has been bubbling for the past several radars, because platform is such a hot word in the industry, is we see a lot of anti-patterns around how organizations try to adopt platforms. And we think the cure for a lot of those anti-patterns is really product management practices. If I have a digital product, if I have a website and I publish it and I ask you all to use it and you don't, well, I'm going to have a little bit of a product problem, and I'm going to have conversations and collect feedback and adjust the website so that it provides value to you and generates pull from you towards the digital product that we're trying to produce. The same idea applies for technical products, and I say technical products in the sense that their customers are technical people. Their customers are developers or data analysts or operations folks. And those are really what digital platforms are meant to solve. Digital platforms are construction tools so that power users can build, the digital equivalent of a house more efficiently. And so to do that, I need to think of those tools as products. I need to apply product management practices to them, which means I need to make sure that I'm capturing value for my customers, for other delivery teams. I'm making their life easier. accelerating maybe their path to production, or simplifying their access to key business capabilities, which is a way of reducing cognitive load that Georgina spoke about previously. And I need to make sure that I balance the effort that I spend in solving one team's problems more deeply versus broadening the adoption curve by looking at other customers as well, and that those types of trade-offs occur every day in the product world. But it's really that focus on value. What a lot of organizations do is create some platform tooling and then, say, try to use the manager stick and force teams to use it. And that can work in the early days. In fact, actually, my understanding is that's how Google started with Borg. But they quickly have to convert that to generating pool from the customer teams, because it has to solve problems for them to sustain momentum over time, which Google has certainly done. They've invested a tremendous amount in their internal platforms. And so the idea of forcing teams to use platforms is not what you would expect out of product management. I would never force you to use my market-facing digital product. I would encourage you to use it and try to have a value proposition that encourages you to use it. It also means, thinking about self-service capability rather than sort of ticketing workflows and shared service capabilities. So there's a lot of power in adopting technical product management, and there's a whole bubbling ecosystem around this emerging role of technical product managers in the industry at large to scale the developer talent that you have to make the most use of it through product thinking, where you consider that you have a little bit of an internal marketplace. You're never going to have the same market dynamics, but you want to encourage the same types of thinking in terms of the feedback loops and value propositions.
Thank you, Brandon. We do have a question on this topic, just around technical product management. So the question is, is there a collection somewhere we can read more around some of the anti-patterns that you're talking about? And I guess what good looks like in terms of product mindset. Anything to add there?
We have had several blips over the past several radars around this subject, and then some of the common anti-patterns we put in hold. So there'll be teams that basically have a ticketing system, kind of a shared service environment, and they'll call it a platform team. And we think that's different than the more effective platform teams that we've seen as an example. We've seen some that I mentioned, sort of the forced usage, why you can start that way just to generate momentum because you don't have the same market dynamics internally that you would externally. Continuing that long term, we would consider an anti-pattern. We consider an anti-pattern for a platform team to simply be the back-end implementation team for a front end. If they're too tightly coupled, that's not really a scaled delivery platform so much as it is just an implementation partner for a particular digital product. So those are some examples. And I see Naeem's question on product management thinking. I've certainly read some books on product management, digital product management at large, and I'll have to look up some books if I have time. But I know that I follow a paid newsletter from somebody named Gurgly Rose. The Pragmatic Engineer is what you would search for to find it. And I'm not sure which of the articles are behind his paywall and which aren't, but he's written several articles on this emerging practice of technical product management as well.
And maybe even books like Project to Product might be valid here too, right, Brandon? Sort of moving from project thinking to product thinking in terms of long-lived capability teams, avoiding that build it and they will come, making sure you have, all that product thinking in your internal developer platform. So yeah, that's another book recommendation that might be along the same, along the same lines. Yeah.
I know we're not having enough of recommendations, but I can't help myself. I need to recommend Mark Kagan's books around product thinking. Inspired, I think one of them, and then the other title I don't remember. And he gave an excellent, Empowered, yes. And he gave an excellent talk on platform products specifically. Very, very nice talk there as well. Thank you, folks.
Thanks. And we'll do our best to put those in the chat so that I know someone's asking specifically for the link. So we'll try to do that as soon as we get a moment. Thanks for asking. Shall we, move on to the next theme, perhaps, Georgina, that you'd like to share with us all?
Yes, a lot of blips around machine learning came up, and we thought that it's better if we kind of put this out there as a blip, the mainstreaming of machine learning, and why we think there's a mainstreaming process going on in regards to machine learning. Mostly because maybe a decade ago, machine learning, at least when I was starting my computer science career, my software engineering career, it was a thing for the few, a kind of a niche vibe it had back then. And if you didn't have enough computational power, if you didn't know specific languages and tools, you couldn't be part of the game, let's say. Plus, there were a lot of questions in regards to ethics of data sets used, how do we ensure privacy, how do we ensure handling of personal data, and so on and so forth. And now we've seen a number of tools and ways to answer those questions. And first, starting with computational power, it has grown throughout different devices where we build and run ML tools. And we now speak about federated machine learning with machine learning models that provide both, let's say, the desired result as well as good handling of personal information. And another great field is the so-called tiny ML. It allows models to be executed in different devices and also use free resources if necessary, and still have answers in place around sensitive data. There are other concerns around, again, ethics, data curation, what kind of data sets we use for model training. And another tool and model is Stable Diffusion that is able to highlight all these three concepts of how do we make sure machine learning and the concerns around dispersed data are addressed. So we see, again, to summarize, better computational power, better federation and governance around it, more conversation happening around ethics, different teams, different domains, understanding the power of machine learning, not only on a research theoretical base, but on a more day-to-day product development. We can now use DALL-E for image and painting production, and from the comfort of our house, let's say, and we have it on our day-to-day, let's say, basket e-shopping carts. So we see only advancements to go. We still need to monitor how this will happen, how this will affect software development and software products. But we have come a long way, let's say.
Thank you, Georgina. And we have a few open questions still, and we've still got a little bit of time, so invite folks to share more questions if you have them, especially on that last one, mainstreaming of ML. Do any of our speakers want to take any of those questions, or can I share them with you if you haven't had a chance to take a look?
How do you view machine learning as this coding, right? This is the one, at least I saw for no more. This is very interesting. I'd like to hear what the rest of you, Vanessa and Brandon, what do you think? And the rest of the speakers, the rest of the attendees, if you have any ideas, please drop them on the chat. It's interesting, like as a developer, let's say, and will it make my life easier? Let's say, will it help me be a better developer? Will it help us write better software? We still have a question though. How is it, for example, GitHub Copilot or any other tools were trained with what code, for example? What are the data sources? Is it legal? Is it ethical? Is it for good use? How do we make sure there's a good trade-off there? Will that obviate our jobs? I don't think so personally. We don't think so personally for any time to come. But we need more time to understand how we will incorporate Copilot tools in our day-to-day. Once we resolve whether it makes sense to use them, and we are not, let's say, copywriting anyone's code, we're not taking advantage of open source projects, and it's still a fair, let's say, use for software developers. I don't know what you folks think.
Yeah, I've been playing around with this. So I maintain an open source testing tool I have been using Copilot a little bit in the context of maintaining that. I've heard from some friends and colleagues that they've been quite impressed with Copilot. I admit my own experience so far, maybe it's just the use cases I've seen it in, hasn't provided a tremendous lift for my development. I do expect it could. I expect it to provide just a little bit of a lift. I think it's easy to overstate how much lift it can provide, because I think you still, at the end of the day, have to take accountability for the code that you write. And I do think, as Georgina said, that this is new enough in the industry that there's some, I think, healthy concern around the legality of the training data that Microsoft has used, because they obviously take advantage of the GitHub platform where they do have access to more source code than probably anyone in the world. But the controls around the barriers you put around that, it's a new approach. So we're all kind of figuring that out. And it's probably going to take a little bit of time to sort of shake through the appropriate use cases, the inappropriate use cases, and the boundaries for protection. But I'm excited by it. I think it's an interesting approach. I think it could provide some incremental lift in the same vein as IDE refactoring tools provided some incremental lift. Maybe not as broad across the entire code base, but to sort of help accelerate the building of what you're doing. I think it's easy to overstate it and make it kind of a silver bullet, and I don't think it's that.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, Brandon. I'm seeing a little bit of a theme in a couple of questions that we have around the blips that didn't make it, or at least the blips that we haven't presented today, in this upcoming radar. And so one is maybe for you, Brandon, as a member of Doppler, were there any blips that you lobbied for during the Doppler discussions that didn't quite make it into this upcoming radar? And then similarly, I'll just share both and you can choose if you want to answer both or one or the other. But relating to your theme of product mindset with platform engineering, there's a question around, is the startup way or some of the innovation accounting techniques, did that show up anywhere during when the radar was being curated this year as well?
Yeah, and I'll push this back to front. So for Justin's question around the startup way, I don't recall any blips that came from that. I mean, many years back, I think there was certainly a lot of enthusiasm around lean startup ideas, and there's a lot of practices that have come out of that, from continuous deployment and MVPs and A/B testing and so forth, that are pretty standard fare nowadays. I don't recall a recent conversation around that. Salim's question around blips that we lobbied for, or I guess, darn it, I was hoping he asked, are there blips that we lobbied for? And the answer is yes. The specifics of those blips, I've had more than one opportunity to sleep since then. There are a lot of blips that we look at during the radar, and because of the way that we collect them, each Doppler member is collecting blips from their region, so it's collecting a number for North America. We had many blips that came out of North America that didn't make the radar. The details of the specific ones, unfortunately, going to be hard to pull up on the spot. But absolutely, that's kind of the way the process works. Is the Doppler member who captured that blip from the region or the group within Thoughtworks represents it to the Doppler group, and there's a vote. When the vote is some votes incur a pretty healthy debate and conversation, and some, it's pretty straightforward to move on. And we do a good job of capturing that so that we can inform the perspectives that we write about the blips afterwards. But I'd be hard put to pull up a specific example.
Sounds good. And we're nearly, we've got about 5 more minutes remaining, so we can tackle any of these other questions if there's time. There is another one continuing on around Copilot. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in and tackle that one. The question is around thoughts on the copywriting aspects of Copilot, if anyone has a thought on that.
I think Georgina and I both hinted at this, which is, I think right now, you should be a little bit wary because it's so early days. And so I think there is some healthy concern. I know Microsoft, GitHub, doing what they can to establish the guardrails that they put in place around that. But you also can look on Twitter and you can see examples of people who at least claim that it seems to be pulling the copyrighted code. So I think that there is some healthy concern that we should all have, as sort of we're all shaking the trees on this new approach to code generation. in terms of making sure that the guardrails are in fact in place and that there's no, accidental, I don't think that they would do anything malicious, but sort of accidental leakage of information that shouldn't be leaked into the training data.
Thank you, Brandon.
So I saw the last question added. I apologize. I realize we're kind of jumping around these, but on low code platforms, I admit I don't know what MXDP stands for, but low code certainly gets a lot of buzz in the industry right now. And I do think it's a different approach to what GitHub Copilot has done in terms of an attempt at trying to make developers' lives easier. We have put blips on previous radars, not this one, that inform some perspective, and Thoughtworks has published some articles around that. I published a relatively tricky one, tricky is not the right word, potentially controversial one last year called "You Can't Buy Integration." So if you search for that, you'll read at least my opinion on low-code tools. But a lot of it is reflective of a previous radar blip that we called bounded low-code platforms. And this is an idea that comes from domain-driven design, where you take a bounded context. What a lot of low-code platforms will try to do is, it's their product, so it's understandable. They're trying to take over a healthy amount of your ecosystem. And I think there's a lot of value in low-code tools, but I think you have to put them in the box. I think that you have to make sure that you're using an appropriate decision lens to say, okay, in this area, because it's the strategic, we need certain software engineering principles, we need to move fast, we need to evolve this over time. Probably more appropriate for general purpose coding language. This area right here, we have some orchestration that we can simplify, or some connection to some system of records. That might be a good opportunity for some low code platforms.
Okay, thank you, Brandon. Just doing a little bit of a time check. It looks like we are almost out of time here today. What I'd like to do is really thank our wonderful speakers, Brandon Byars and Georgina Giannoukou. Thank you so much for joining us today. And you know what else was really great? It was awesome to see some familiar names coming up in the chat and the Q&A. So thank you to all our participants as well for your many questions and for joining us today. We really appreciate it. The Thoughtworks Tech Radar Volume 27, it's going to be coming out really shortly, so please keep an eye out. And we hope this sneak peek that we've shared today has given you a bit of a taste for what's to come. So thank you all.
Thank you all. Cheers.